Welcome, everybody. Hope you're all safe and well and enjoying your summer as best you can right now. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Um, the idea for this conversation came about this spring while we were all on lockdown and in quarantine. We started hearing from folks that more people are taking this time to really examine their larger financial picture, and we're sort of looking for guidance on issues specifically related to charitable giving. For example, designating the Nature Conservancy and other organizations that they support as beneficiaries of their retirement plans, leaving real estate and other non-cash assets in their wills, and so on. And so we came up with the idea today to invite some Conservancy staff and a couple of our friends and donors to participate in sort of a facilitated discussion. So this will last for about 30 or 40 minutes today, and we'll leave the final 20 minutes or so to take your questions and respond to those. And we'll do this at the end of the conversation. So throughout the discussion, if you have questions for our panelists, please type them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It should be at the bottom of your screen. There's a little icon with a speech bubble there. We'll try to get through as many of these questions as time allows at the end of the presentation. And then lastly, just a heads up, I wanted to let you know there'll be a short 3-question survey at the end as well. That'll pop up on your screen. And we'd love to have your feedback on the presentation today. So with that, I'll take a few minutes to introduce myself and my colleagues, and we'll get the conversation started. My name is Kelly Blanford. I am the Associate Director of Philanthropy here in Kansas. Joining me is John Coffer. John is our Director of Philanthropy and currently acting Associate State Director here in Kansas. He's responsible for making sure that all of our programs and wonderful conservation work in our state get fully funded. John and I are both local resources available anytime, so we'll share contact information. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time. Also joining me is Adam Eggemeyer. He is our regional gift strategist. Adam works collaboratively with donors on non-cash gifts and strategy in 9 states across the US, as well as for our Africa program. Generally, these are gifts that benefit TNC's conservation work, both now and in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam. I'm going to ask Adam to elaborate a little bit more on his role and let you know a little bit more about what he does and what he can help with. So Adam,
Thanks.
take it away.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that. It's a nice intro. Yeah, so in my role, I often get the privilege of working side by side with our philanthropy teams like these fine folks in Kansas. But more importantly, at homes and at kitchen tables, at least pre-COVID anyway. Now that often takes the form more of video and phone calls. But working side by side with folks on gifts of great significance with some of the most generous and passionate supporters of the Conservancy all across the middle part of the country. Like as Kelly said, I work with 9 states in the Midwest and Great Plains, as well as the Africa program. And so most times this collaboration takes the form of attempting to equip donors with information that would help them feel more informed in having a discussion with their tax, legal, or financial professionals about whether or not that giving mechanism makes sense for them. And what I tend to love most about that when working on gifts that benefit the Nature Conservancy now or later or even forever is that it's often a pairing, as I shared at a recent board meeting in Kansas, of gifts that make sense in the heart and in the head. So gifts that logically make sense because of the benefits that a donor may get, but also because these sorts of gifts are ones that emotionally fulfill a checklist for folks. And so when you layer both of those things in together, I'd like to add that the Nature Conservancy especially, donors are incredibly generous in their giving through estate plans. We just this past year, 29% of all the undesignated funds that were received by the organization were from estate gifts, and that those funds account for somewhere in the neighborhood in any given year of 15 to 20% of all the revenue that we receive, which is about 2 to 3 times the national average for nonprofits. And so while it's incredible to hear of this overwhelming amount of support, the need, of course, remains immense. And so John and I were just talking the other day about this overwhelming need of the work that we do. John, maybe you can share some of those numbers with folks.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. A couple numbers we were talking about. They do an annual report every single year that just came out a week or two ago. I think the Giving USA report that shows about $425 billion, I think in that neighborhood, was given by Americans to charity last year. And 3% of all philanthropy in the US of that number went to a category that they call environment, conservation, and animal welfare. So that's gifts to the Nature Conservancy, to the Humane Society, ASPCA, all that. It's a very broad category. And I was telling you, Adam, I was reading a report from 2012. So these are old numbers, but they did an analysis back then of what the cost would be annually on a global basis to protect biodiversity into the future. And the best guess they came up with was about $36 billion a year needed between now and 2050 to really protect biodiversity. And you had seen some numbers that were even higher than that. So I think to your point, planned giving is a really excellent way to expand the giving in general to conservation and allow us to do a lot of the work that we couldn't do unless we had some bigger gifts, such as land purchase, et cetera.
Kelly, I think you're muted.
Yeah, with that, I'm gonna dive right into the questions here and get the conversation started. What would you say, John and Adam, both is the easiest way to make a legacy gift to the Nature Conservancy? What's maybe the simplest way without a lot of complications?
I'll defer to Adam, but I would say probably beneficiary designation, designating TNC as a beneficiary of life insurance, an IRA, 401k, that kind of thing. But Adam, what do you say?
Yeah, you'll have to forgive me too, John. I agree. I keep muting between because my children are in quarantine stomping around upstairs right above my head. But I'd agree. The beneficiary designation is often referred to as folks as the 5-minute legacy gift, because you can oftentimes change a beneficiary designation in something like 5 minutes using an online form where you have often a spouse to authorize that as well. But you don't have to redo your entire estate. It's kind of a quick and easy way to do it. And believe it or not, 90% of legacy gifts to the Nature Conservancy come from beneficiary designations or from simple wills. So it's an astonishing number. We know there's a lot of support that comes in, and of that support, 90% comes via these couple mechanisms. And it's so easy. As a matter of fact, when I joined the Nature Conservancy's team a little over 4 years ago, one of the first things I did was name the Nature Conservancy as beneficiary of my former workplace's IRA. So I rolled over the account and named that new account with the Nature Conservancy as beneficiary. And after reviewing that with my spouse, having her sign that form electronically, we were able to have that done truly in 5 minutes.
Oh, that's great. Well, so if that's the simplest way, what are some of the more complicated ways? And maybe Adam, you can share complicated in the sense that it's complicated for the donor versus complicated for TNC, and maybe just elaborate a little bit on the types of gifts that we can accept.
Sure. Yeah. That's a really difficult question actually, because every gift is different. Every gift is unique, and even gifts that start out simple can sometimes be very, very complicated by the time we walk through all the machinations of that. But in general, gifts like private business interests, so someone owns a private business that they'd like to donate, gifts using complex trusts, including charitable trusts, gifts that are factoring in estate tax issues. Can be incredibly complicated for a donor to work with, trying to navigate state estate tax in some states, or death tax, and then also federal estate tax issues. And then last but certainly not least, real estate can sometimes be a bit complex to navigate for a donor, although we try to make that as easy as possible, at least for what we can control. And so I would say, as kind of an overarching statement, these type of gifts are ones that go hand in hand with the recommendation that advisors are involved proactively because of the complexity that's involved with that. But I do want to add that those gifts that, while maybe tending to lean more to complex, can be quite easy, sometimes, depending on exactly what a donor would like to do and where they're at on the spectrum of benefiting TNC now versus benefiting TNC down the road.
Yeah, I'm going to break in, Kelly. I think that might be a good transition right there. So we actually have Dean Geldner on. We're going to introduce here in a second because he can speak to this a little bit. But we get questions quite a bit, and we just got one this week that you and I have been talking about, where people will contact us and say, I have some land I want to give the Nature Conservancy. Do you keep this as a nature preserve? What will you do with this if I give it to you guys?
Yeah, and it's a wonderful question, and I'd love to pause there at the very beginning and say that any donor that reaches out to us about their land is really putting a deep trust in us, and we're immensely thankful for that, and truly honored to be thought of, in a way that is involved or tied with their family legacy, because oftentimes this is land that's been in families for generations, and we're being thought of as a trusted ally or recipient of this land. And so, John, to simply answer your question, it depends with any particular piece of real estate, whether the donor in question or prospective donor would have a desire for the Nature Conservancy to own the property, whether they would have a desire for protection on the property, conservation protection, or whether they are open to the idea that the property would ultimately be sold and have the proceeds used to further work across the board for the Conservancy. And I would say the more flexible as a donor is to the idea that we would apply whichever of those categories made sense, the easier it is to work with gifts of real estate, whether it's now or in the future. But that also varies state by state. So the work that Kansas is doing for conservation differs than the work that New York State is doing for conservation, which differs from the work that Puerto Rico would be doing for conservation. And so because of those unique properties of the land that's held and the priorities of the various states, and then layering in the now versus later timing, it can get a little variable depending on that property. But again, first and foremost, it's truly an honor to have donors reach out about it. And we want to understand their priorities for this legacy property before we do anything else.
Yeah, speaking of it being an honor, we've got Dean Geldner. I had the honor to spend a day with Dean Geldner and his wife, Jean, who were visiting from the DC area. Dean grew up in Wichita, and don't want to take away from him, but we asked him to join us and talk about the really meaningful gift that he gave of a family legacy to support our work in the Flint Hills here in Kansas. Dean, do you mind speaking about that a little bit right now? You're on mute too, Dean.
There, how's that?
There we go.
All right. Well, thanks, John. Yeah, I guess it's a fair question to ask why a couple in Maryland would be wanting to give real estate to the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. But John sort of gave the punchline of the joke in that I grew up in Wichita. I was born and raised in Wichita, but I left in 64 right after high school to go to college. And I've never really lived in Kansas since. I've been in Chicago, I've been in Colorado, I've been in California, And for the last 20 plus years, I've been in the DC area. I became a veterinarian and did some equine practice in California, but the bulk of my professional career has been in policy and regulatory work. And in the 80s, I started to develop a wildlife interest. I've now been a member of the American Association of Wildlife Veterinarians for over 35 years. So I had these policy and wildlife interests. And I brought those to DC in 1997 to try and combine them and do a little policy work for wildlife. But my roots have always been in Kansas, and my parents lived their whole lives in Kansas. In fact, they came from family farms south of Wichita near Derby. My dad's family homesteaded in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. And my mom's family came a little later, but by early 1900s, they were working farms, and my parents were growing up in the farming community of Derby. But by 1965, the Derby had grown right up to my father's family farm, literally to their front door. And so since neither my father nor my uncle wanted to take the farm over, it all got sold and turned into houses. My mother's family farm was further out. And while parts of it have been sold over the years, there's one 80-acre section parcel that has passed down to me. And it's still being farmed as it has been for the past 100 years or so. So anyway, my father lived to be 102. He just died about 8 years ago. And Gene and I made many, many, many trips to Kansas, checking in on him, but also just visiting Kansas. And a couple of those trips are significant to this conversation because in one of them, we went down to the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve in Oklahoma near Pawhuska because I wanted to see the bison. And we walked out on that open land, and it was amazing. We weren't very far from the headquarters, and pretty soon you looked around and you couldn't see a landmark in any direction. It was like you were on a rolling green ocean. It was like May or June, and it was incredible. So that was a lasting experience. And then a few years later, in 2006, I turned 60, and my wife says, "Well, what do you want to do for your birthday?" And I said, "Well," and I'd just been reading the Nature Conservancy magazine, so I said, "I think I want to go to the Symphony in the Flint Hills." It was the first one at the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. So my wife, being the woman she is, got us patrons tickets. And so we spent 2 great days at that event. Loved the preserve. The concert was wonderful. Got to meet Governor Sebelius. Got to meet the Paul Winter consort, who was part of that initial concert. And Paul Winter had been at Northwestern a few years ahead of me, so it was a nice connection to make. And so that was a real special experience. So after those 2 episodes, I got to thinking, well, what am I going to do with this piece of farmland that I still own? I don't have any biological children to pass it on to. I have wonderful stepchildren and grandchildren, but none of them have ever set foot in Kansas. So, what am I thinking here? And, this farm, I have to admit, is sort of our retirement ace in the hole. We're not really wealthy people, and we may need the money that land represents down the road. I hope not, but we may. But so far, we're doing all right. So we got to thinking, well, if we'd like to use that land to help further conservation work in the tallgrass prairies in the Flint Hills, maybe we should think about giving it to the Nature Conservancy. So that's what we're in the process of doing right now. And John said, gift we have given. I think he's slightly optimistic in that it's not a done deal yet, but we are in the process of doing it. We're working with our estate attorney to help set up our trusts in such a way that we will be co-trustees. And then when we are both gone, our successor trustee will have the directions to pass the land on to the Nature Conservancy in Kansas, or if we have sold it, the proceeds will be maintained in a separate account. And what's left in that account would go to the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. And Adam and John have been very helpful in this process. They've suggested language, and we're working back and forth. And it's not a done deal yet, but I'm pretty optimistic that it's going to go okay. So that's in a nutshell kind of how we got to where we are. This land sustained my family for a long time. And this seems like a good way to give back and the right time to do it. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Dean.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. That's a wonderful story, and I think speaks to really a larger question, a larger point. You know, one of our strongest convictions at the Nature Conservancy is that we always honor donor intent and you know, recognize how meaningful and important gifts are, both to the organization but also to the donor. So I'm going to ask John and Adam to maybe speak a little bit to how we as TNC ensure proper designation of gifts and fully honor donor intent, especially in planned gifts that may be coming at a much later date. So in other words, how do we make sure the gift goes to support our work in Kansas or, you know, Mongolia, or to one of our larger whole system strategies that you might be passionate about, like the Mississippi River Basin or our work on coral reefs? How do we ensure that, you know, those gifts are designated properly internally? And I'll let John and Adam speak to that.
I'm happy to say a few words. Thanks, Kelly. It is a really important point. I think some people may not realize you really can't designate your gift really down into very specific kind of language to benefit a specific preserve, benefit you know, our work with specific species. We usually advocate that you try to kind of make the language as broad as possible. And I know, Dean, you and Jean and I had this conversation when you were in Kansas last fall about capturing your intent and wanting to support wildlife and the bison on Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, but leaving it broad enough because conditions do change. And it maybe sounded like I was trying to shuffle you out the door earlier with saying the gift is a done deal, but you know, really we're hoping it's many decades before that gift matures if it comes to the Conservancy. So, you know, by then conditions may change. So let's leave it broadly enough that your intentions are honored, but our hands aren't tied in, say, 30, 40 years with the language that was in your documents to how we do that. So that's what I would have to say. And Dean, maybe you have something to say, and Adam can elaborate more than that, I think.
No, I think you're right, John. I think, you know, as a veterinarian with wildlife interests, I would love to see the money used to, you know, further healthy wildlife populations and balanced ecosystems. But that's really what Nature Conservancy is all about anyway. And you can't tie your hands too much. I mean, you got to have some flexibility. Conditions change, as you say. And so, you know, I'm sure we're going to find a nice, comfortable balance, the sweet spot where everybody's happy with the language. I'm not worried about that at all.
Yeah, that's appreciated. And John, I would add to that, it's so wonderful to get to have the conversation with people while they're alive, rather than trying to guess from their estate plan documents what their intent was. And so we really heavily, because we honor donor intent and put that as such a strong priority, we really prioritize talking with donors transparently and proactively during life to make sure that we can honor that wonderful gift that they want to give to us and respect their anonymity or desire for anonymity with the gift, and be able to recognize that and celebrate it while they're alive. There's another part or two kind of rolled into that I think are really important. And first and foremost, it's allowing, you know, once the hard work is done and a gift has been made, allowing that gift to serve as a second gift to the Nature Conservancy. So I'm quite fond of saying that the second gift, and sometimes the even more important gift, is the gift of encouragement to others. And so Dean, Kent and Sharon, you're doing that here on deck, but being able to share your story as an encouragement to other people to join you in doing the same is almost as powerful, if not more so, as giving the gift yourself. And so given that need that we have, that encouragement is not only powerful, but it helps to prevent some challenges that come up later. And I do have a very brief story I want to share about that. I worked about a year ago with some really, really passionate folks that live in the middle part of the country. I won't say where, but live in the middle part of the country, not Kansas, and had put the Nature Conservancy in their estate plans for an amazing gift, $1.4 million. And this gift was, per their plan document, designated to penguin habitat in the middle of the United States. And so for a lot of you, my understanding is, like you, that it's been a good 10,000 years or so since there was much penguin habitat in the middle of the United States. And it'll likely be a good bit of time before the Nature Conservancy would have that opportunity again. And so because the donor shared this information during their lifetime, we were able to proactively talk about it. They actually changed their designation in their estate plan document to climate work. So they made it very broad. We went from this very, very refined designation that would have been effectively unspendable when it would have been realized, to a much broader designation that'd be very easy to check the box. And what's wonderful about that is they were very, very happy with that change. You know, Dean, perhaps to your case with you and Jean, it's a scenario that fit in their wheelhouse. It just wasn't the way they had worded the plan before they connected with us. But had they died in the interim, we would have had a $1.4 million gift to penguin habitat in the middle part of the US that would have been effectively unspendable, because we couldn't have honored that when it was intended to be received. And so the analogy I have used often before I had that story was, if someone wanted to give us $1 billion in their estate plan to create the first chapter of the Nature Conservancy on the moon, it wouldn't change the fact that $1 billion wouldn't do it. We couldn't actually create the chapter on the moon for $1 billion, and that maybe a conversation with that donor prior would have allowed them to realize that. So I hope that answered or added to, John, what you and Dean were saying.
Yeah, no, thank you, Adam. We want to get to, we have another guest. It's really good to see Kent and Sharon on the phone today. Adam, can you maybe speak, and I'm going to ask you to introduce Kent and Sharon. We've both met them at separate times, but can you talk a little bit about life income gifts? This is a really interesting way people can support the Conservancy, and I'm not very well versed in this area. I always call you for support on this, but there are ways that people can make a charitable gift that will actually pay them an amount of money annually while supporting the Nature Conservancy later in their life or upon their death. You and I have worked on a couple gifts like this. We just did one a few months ago in Lecompton, Kansas, and it's just always really gratifying and kind of blows my mind. It's just kind of this perfect win-win thing. But can you talk about that a little bit and introduce Kent and Sharon to talk about your experience with working with them?
Yeah, I sure can, John. I humorously, you think that was the last trip I made before COVID struck and locked everything down. So otherwise, I don't know that I would think of it so fondly going on a trip with you, but the fact that it was the last one means that my heart is really in Kansas and longing for that again. So I had the distinct pleasure working with Kent and Sharon a few years back and being able to visit with them in their home on a trip to Kansas. I think my first trip to Kansas, actually, with the Nature Conservancy. And so I would prefer, I think, to let them chat a little bit about their gift and what they're comfortable sharing. And then I can perhaps summarize some of the life income gifts and how they work. And so Kent and Sharon, thank you for being on the call today. I'm hoping that you can hear me okay, and that if you can unmute yourself, please feel free to jump right in.
Okay. Before I turn this over to Sharon, Dean, I used to go by the ranch or the farm all the time. We used to hunt up in that area, quail, and that's old home country. We go up from Winfield. So it's good to hear from somebody in that area. I still have friends up there, and of course they've all been swallowed by Derby, but still it was neat country. Sharon, go ahead.
Yes, well, both of us actually were born in Kansas and raised here. Kent in the south part, the Winfield area, and I here in Manhattan. And we both have homesteads. I have a homestead that's up north that my father's family, and then my mother grew up on the homestead south of Junction City. Both of those have left the family at this point. But when Kent and I made our last move, we really got rid of our real estate. And at this point, we no longer have real estate. However, we really care about our planet Earth, and both of us in all circumstances that we see happening and what has happened to this Earth. And when we decided to give a charitable gift, it was focused on Kansas because of our time here and growing up here. But I'm equally delighted when I read the Nature Conservancy magazines to read what is going on all over the world, because global is just what we have to be thinking about. And I love the way Nature Conservancy has hired people who are so qualified, so able to work with the land and help people work with their land more effectively, efficiently. I mean, they're not only working with their land, they're working with a community of people. They're educators. And I feel that that's going to be an answer to all of this. I mean, at some point, people used to think of just buying up the land. No longer do we think that way. We know better, I think. And I'm just really impressed and was so pleased to be able to give anything at all.
Of course, we grew up with the advent of Kanza, so we had the chance to hike Kanza all the time. We also were aware of the tall grass prairie area. And in fact, that's the way I used to come up here to school at Kansas State University. And then, of course, Cheyenne Bottoms, of course. My brother was a waterfowl hunter, so I was introduced early to that particular area, and I love it dearly. And it's been a great place to go. We did move to Oregon for 16 years. And again, we were struck by the work that the Nature Conservancy was doing, particularly in Klamath Falls, great place, and the Alvarado Ranch, and the coastal concerns as well. But the thing that I think I treasure most about the Nature Conservancy is the word trust. I can trust them. And that is indeed a discovery when going around canvassing what groups we could support. And only in the Nature Conservancy could I put all of the pieces together. The amount of money for administration is held where it belongs. The volunteers are able and enthusiastic. It met all of the concerns that Sharon and I had for what we wanted to do with what little we had to offer. So I'm sure we'll never be sorry. And I'm hope that in 100 years, you have really got a hold of the problems.
Thank you both. That's a wonderful testimonial and validation of some wonderful work in Oregon, but work right here at home in Kansas too. And I think, you know, I would tie a little bow around that by saying what's interesting, I think, about the gift that you two decided to give is it's one that gives you a little pat on the back for making the gift. You know, I can't hyperextend my elbow, reaching and patting myself, but it's one that there's a benefit, of course, in the form of a charitable income tax deduction that's received for making the gift. But there also is layered into that the certainty that the gift is made. It's already been given. So like a lot of life income gifts, this is irrevocable once set in place. It's flexible before that and can be changed, but it's locked in once the gift is actually made. And because of that, that charitable income tax deduction comes around. Because of that, also, there's sometimes some capital gains avoidance, some advantage tax treatment when different assets are used. But more importantly, for a lot of folks, there's an income paid back that can really be that pat on the back for the remainder of 1 or 2 lives. And so it was wonderful to get the chance to work with you, to chat a little bit in person. And I don't think we've had a chance to see each other in person or even on video since. So it's great to get to do that and catch up.
And I'll just mention, we got to know you guys through our dear friends, the Stricklers. John Strickler was
Yes,
a founding
yes.
trustee of ours here. Just a great mentor to everybody here, and just passed away a few months ago. So I haven't seen you since that happened as well. But it's so nice to see you guys.
Well, I didn't mention in that presentation that we have included you in our trust upon our deaths. So there is more to come.
Fantastic, and hopefully very, very long into the future. Many,
little
many years, we
longer.
hope. We hope so. We hope so. John, I don't know if that answered your question initially, but yeah, it's wonderful to hear of this additional planned gift as well.
Yeah, thank you guys.
I also want to thank you both for sharing your stories. I have to say that this is what makes our jobs, arguably the best jobs in the world, our friends and donors and people like you. So thank you for that. Adam, I'm going to change the subject here a little bit and ask a question that's particularly relevant for the current times. We briefly mentioned COVID-19 and sort of the hardships that's presented. Many of our donors, including our guests today, are savvy and have a lot of experience with philanthropic giving. Can you give us some insight into what some other folks are doing, maybe with regard to their planning, given all of the impacts from the pandemic?
Sure, yeah, and I can't help but notice this was the moment that John decided to walk away from the screen. So I'd be happy to do that. I'd say first and foremost, there were a lot of tax changes that affected charitable giving and philanthropy in general in the last 2 years already. And then, of course, COVID-19 hit, and there were some reactive changes made that affect charitable giving as well. And so it's a lot to cover, and I in no way want this to be an encyclopedic call where folks are having to hear this regiment of recitation for all of these tax changes. And so I'm going to cover the 3 big ones because I think they're the most relevant. The 3 big changes due to COVID and the corresponding CARES legislation were, number 1, a $300 universal deduction that is available to all taxpayer units. So if an individual files as an individual, great. If they file as a married couple, it's still just $300, even if you're filing married. It's not $300 per person. But a $300 universal deduction if you give at least $300 to charity that is available whether you itemize or not. And so it's an option for every taxpayer to support, at least in a small way, the charities that are very near and dear to them. And it should be mentioned that this is being looked at right now as something that could be expanded in the future and carry on long into the future at a higher number to promote charitable support. The second piece there is that this year, for the first time in the history of this, at least the current tax code, but the previous Reagan tax code era as well, there is a 100% limit on the adjusted gross income cap for gifts of cash. And so donors who decide to be extra philanthropic this year can give up to 100% of their adjusted gross income and deduct it fully if they give a gift of cash. And again, that's something we'd be happy to expand on more either later in the Q&A or in subsequent conversations with philanthropic staff. But know that the scale can completely balance this year in a way that it has not been able to in the past. And then last but certainly not least, the third point, there are no required minimum distributions from IRAs this year. And so for folks that are over 72, you'll remember that this number used to be 70 and a half, but then that changed to 72. For folks that are over 72, they have to pull money out of accounts that are traditional IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, and other tax deferred accounts. And there is a 1-year suspension on that for 2020 because of COVID-19. And so when I mentioned that, it may not seem obvious right away that that is tied to charitable giving, but because there is legislation in place that allows taxpayers to give straight from a retirement account, namely a traditional IRA, to a charity and have that count as their distribution, there is a ripple effect to charitable giving, because many people who are philanthropic anyway gave money from those accounts directly to the Nature Conservancy. And so those three things are pretty significant effects of CARES legislation this year for COVID. And you might logically wonder then, okay, with those changes, what are really savvy donors hearing when they're talking to their advisors, when they're talking to charities like the Nature Conservancy? And I'd say the few things that they're hearing as far as recommendations for how to move forward are, number one, using money that's already been gifted, like money that's in donor advised funds and private foundations. And so these are often, middle class and wealthier donors that have already set up funds like this, received their deduction a while ago, and can use those funds that won't hit them in the wallet now to make generous charitable gifts and help sustain these organizations. The second, of course, with a 100% AGI limit this year, is the gift of cash. While cash seems like a bit of scarcity now, given kind of the turtle shelling that a lot of us are doing with COVID, for folks that have cash on hand and want to support charities, there's truly been no better time to do it, as far as the ability to use that deduction to benefit you in your taxes. The third category I would say that we're seeing a lot of savvy donors gravitate to is still using appreciated stock. Because stock, while it's had a little bit of a dip lately and a recovery and then a dip again, it seems to bounce up and down here lately, we're still seeing numbers that are 3 or 4 times higher than 10, 15 years ago. And so for many folks, they've had a historic run up in stock that's still quite advantageous to give. And last, but certainly not least, there is this idea of lumping. And lumping sounds maybe a bit vulgar, but really what it's getting at is using your vehicles like donor advised funds, using mountaintop gifts to support a charity for a 2 or 3 or more year period by giving all at once, rather than giving $5,000 every year, giving $15,000 at once, and then not giving anything for the subsequent years so that you could take advantage of the changes in tax code. And so I also want to leave that part of the commentary by saying if you squint and look really, really hard, there's a silver lining there in the distance in the time of COVID, in that people are thinking about their estate planning far more in COVID than they were prior to COVID. And that's supported, I think, by some statistics indicating that there was a 176% increase in online will planning in the first 2 months of COVID. And so people were thinking about it, was top of mind a little more while in lockdown. And we've heard from donors that they finally felt like they had the time to absorb setting all of their stuff out and finally planning where it would go and who's the right person for it.
Well, given the time, I want to make sure we have time for questions here at the end. And again, please feel free to insert your questions into the Q&A feature, that little icon at the bottom of your screen. Adam, we've got a couple here for you. And John, I think you can both respond to each of these questions. And one that I'm really curious about is what is the most interesting gift that you've ever worked on? Do you have any good stories for us that may highlight some unique gift situations?
I can go ahead and bring one up that you were involved with from a distance just recently, because it kind of highlights the COVID question and something else that hasn't really come up yet, except in passing. gift of other assets, we had a call from a woman who was a longtime member just a couple of months ago. And she had had cancer for a couple of years and was entering hospice and didn't have time to redo her will, but it was talking with her attorney, and she had a gift of a bunch of silver that she had bought as an investment years and years ago. And she really wanted to know that we were going to be able to get that gift of silver here and use it for our work in the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. And so we worked through her attorney, and this was during quarantine, and I mean, incredibly touching situation where we got to go over to her house and collect the silver and then take it to a silver dealer. And we had all this lined up beforehand. She actually passed away the next day, but it was being able, she really wanted to know that this gift was going to be spent in exactly the way that she wanted it to be spent, and just being able to be a part of that. And working through the issues around COVID and keeping social distancing with a colleague, and figuring out the security measures of how we're going to, drive many pounds of silver in the back of an SUV over to a dealer's place, and all that was, it was complex. But the colleague and I that I got to go with, Ruth, if people on the call know Ruth, we both just left the office. I mean, just feeling so enlivened and grateful that we got to be a part of this final moment with this really valuable and sweet donor that had been part of us for a long time. So that's what comes to my mind immediately.
Yeah, so I'll also add that very briefly, the story that comes to mind right off the top of my head is one that I remember working with a donor couple in Western Nebraska. I'm sorry, it wasn't Kansas, but Western Nebraska, that the husband and wife were in their mid 90s and were still farming their about 300-acre farm. And when I was chatting with them a little bit about their giving and then what their plan was, they mentioned two things. Number one, they didn't want to farm anymore, but they had no choice because that's how they earned their income. And then two, their kids lived all three in different countries. But none of the kids were in the United States or had an interest in farming at all. And the gift was so powerful, I think, because I was truly able to say to them on the spot, how'd you like to stop farming, get paid quadruple the amount of money that you're getting paid now, get an enormous charitable income tax deduction, and then the full value of your farm, have your kids be paid over a 20-year period after your death, all while knowing that you're benefiting the Nature Conservancy and a couple other charities with the full value 20 years down the line. And this gentleman said, where do I sign? And using a planning instrument called a charitable remainder trust, we were able to do just that. And so I don't want to get into the minutia and bore people in the middle of the day and have them have to take a nap with reciting off how that works, but I'd be happy to follow up after the fact.
This is why we have you on, Adam. I'm good at being a grunt and schlepping around a bunch of coins, but that kind of minutia is really challenging, and that's why we have you on staff. Thank you for that.
No problem.
Got another question here for Adam. What is the first step that people should take when they're planning their estate and considering a charitable gift? Is there sort of a standard first step, or does it vary depending on situation?
Yeah, that's a really good one too, and a big question. And I think I'd respond, but first and foremost, you want to think about what you'd like to do, not how you do it or what the instrument is associated with how you do it. Think about of what you'd like to do, what legacy you'd like to leave, and then build from there, working with qualified professionals, working with philanthropic folks like us at the Conservancy. And I may add to that too. I've shared this story once before, and I'll be extremely brief with it, but you don't hear the term last will and testament much anymore. Usually it's just referred to as a will. But somebody who files a valid will is a testator. So they have quite literally, from a legal standpoint, made a testament as to what was important to them. And they've filed that in a legal document that is a matter of public record for all time. And so as somebody who does a heck of a lot of genealogy work when I'm on the road in random places with folks like John, traveling around and seeing folks, one of the moments that touched me the most as a charitable planner was seeing a copy finally of my 3 great-grandfather's will, where he had left 2 charities in his estate plan. He died in 1910, and he had 2 charities in his estate plan. And I, 100+ years later, am able to still see that testament that he made. It's a matter of public record for all time. And I would argue, perhaps self-servingly, that gifts to the Nature Conservancy in an estate plan, especially ones that are public record, have that ripple effect of testament for all time as well. I hope that answered it, but focus on what you'd like to do and then think about the testament or the legacy that you're making.
Great. Not seeing a lot more questions in the chat. I might just take this moment to offer an opportunity for final thoughts from John or Adam or our guests. And we've got a few minutes left. In the meantime, contact information is on your screen now for the Kansas chapter. This is our email address and office phone number. Many of us are working from home right now, but we are available, and we'll, our calls are being forwarded, our emails are being forwarded, so you can reach us at any time here in the Kansas office. And we can also put you in touch with Adam as needed. So final thoughts from our panelists today?
Dean, do you have any final thoughts? I'd love to give you and the Smiths the final word if you have anything to say.
I don't think so. But thank you for letting us share our stories, and it sort of helps us lock in. I think that we really are doing what we want to do here, and it feels pretty good. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for joining us.
Yes, and I'd like to say that perhaps we should visit again in the near future and check some things out that in the legal side of this, see if something can be adjusted.
I appreciate all the information that you've given, and I just appreciate Nature Conservancy. I can't think of any place I'd rather be able to give.
My goodness. Yeah. Wow. We appreciate that. And we'll be happy to visit again, assuming if we look in the distant future and squint, as I said, we get to a point where we can actually interact in person again. It sounds like a fantasy.
It does. Maybe I had a conversation with my husband the other day that said, when this is all over, it's going to feel like a luxury. All the little things are going to feel like a luxury again. So maybe that's a silver lining. Well, with that, I think we're all wrapped up. I want to thank our panelists and just, again, just say thank you for joining us today and sharing this with us. Please feel free to reach out at any time, and hopefully we'll all be able to see each other again in person soon. There is a short survey that'll pop up on your screen as the call ends. Just let us know how we did. Let us know what you thought of the webinar today, and take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. Bye.